Hello, virtual VSS attendees. Thank you for watching my talk. I'd like to start off by acknowledging my collaborators, Melissa Trevino here at NCI, the WestET team, Xiaoshu Zhu and Grace Huang, and the McLean Hospital Harvard Medical School team of Yi Liu, Luke Scheuer, and Laura Germain. So everyone knows this William James quote, everyone knows what attention is. What I want to talk about today is that everyone knows what attention is, but no one agrees how to measure it. In particular, I got interested in this problem while looking into the cancer-related cognitive impairments literature, which is almost exclusively conducted using neuropsychological tests. This is a list of the most popular neuropsychological tests of attention in that literature. What you can see is that some of these tests might seem reasonable, even if you may not be familiar with them, but the trail-making test, for example, and the D2 test involve a visual search component, and we all here think that visual search has something to do with attention. Whereas some of these tests are more puzzling. For example, digit span, which is how many digits you can repeat back to a psychologist, or arithmetic, which is how many math word problems you can solve in a given period of time. Okay, that's weird, but why should we care? I mean, we're vision scientists, not neuropsychologists. I would argue that this division between clinical science and basic science is simply not healthy for either discipline. Furthermore, I think that if we adopt the point of view of use-inspired basic research, or also known as Pasteur's quadrant, or as they call it in the medical literature, the reverse translation cycle, we can see that clinical problems are a really good testing bed for theories of cognition, and there's a long history of clinical problems as a source of inspiration. By cutting ourselves off from those, we're really missing out on a lot. But also I think the reverse holds true, that if we could improve the scientific rigor of clinical science and link it more closely to our theories, that we could really help clinical science and thereby potentially actually help people, and that would be great. So our basic research question here is, do neuropsychological attention tests measure the same thing as the attention paradigms we are talking about here at this meeting in vision science? We're building on finding from Liqing Huang and colleagues who studied 257 undergrads at China Normal University and got them to do a battery of 9 primary paradigms from the cognition literature, which you can see on the top here, which includes such widely used paradigms as conjunction search and change detection, and 9 secondary paradigms such as attentional capture or inhibition of return. And they did a factor analysis on the results and found that they needed only one factor to account for the data. They called this the general attention factor, or A, with analogy to G, the general intelligence factor. And I'm plotting these data 2 different ways here, and I'm going to use this kind of plotting later on, so let me orient you here. On the left, we have a bar plot with all of the tests on the y-axis and the loading strength on the x-axis. And the yellow line here indicates our criterion of 0.3. That is, if a test had a loading onto a particular factor of more than 0.3, we said it loaded onto that factor. Huang et al. Didn't necessarily use that criterion. On the right, we have a more geometric plot where the tests are around the outside, the factors in the center, and the thickness of the green lines indicates how much a particular test loads onto that factor. And you can see here that all the primary paradigms in purple load onto the A factor, along with some of the secondary paradigms, such as visual marking and task switching, whereas attentional capture and inhibition of return do not load onto the A factor. So our logic here is that there is following Huang et al., this general attention factor exists, and a number of widely used experimental paradigms load onto this factor. Furthermore, we're making the critical assumption here is that tests that load onto A measure attention. Therefore, if we do a factor analysis with some of these widely used cognitive science paradigms and some neuropsych tests rather, we can see that those neuropsych tests that load onto A are good attention tests, and those that don't are not good attention tests. So here we teamed up with Laura Germain's group at testmybrain.org. To get an online sample, we aim to have 300 in order to have a sufficiently stable factor analysis solution. We got 646, so that's good. Our test battery included health and demographics questionnaires, 6 experimental paradigms, and 8 neuropsych tests. It took approximately 1 hour, but did not have to be completed in a single session. The basic attention paradigms include visual working memory, spatial flanker interference, approximate number sense, spatial configuration search, and multiple object tracking, which we expected to load onto A, and a ringer, the gradual onset continuous performance test, which we expected, which is more of a sustained attention test, and we hypothesized that some of the neuropsych tests might actually load more onto this sustained attention factor. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into the details here. I'm hoping most of you are familiar with most of these tests. You're probably also not familiar with these neuropsych tests. These were taken from the list, mostly taken from the list I showed you earlier. I mentioned the trail making test, the arithmetic assessment, forward and backward digit span and letter cancellation. We also used a spatial span, which is kind of like digit span, but for spatial locations, and a digit symbol coding task. So here's the correlation matrix. On the left as a heat map, and on the right as sort of a spring-loaded network, which I think is a little more useful. And what you can see is that you might expect, I've plotted those tests we expect to load onto A in blue, and you might expect all those tests to cluster together, along with maybe some of the green neuropsych tests. But that is not what happened. In fact, we see that flanker interference and visual search are sort of separated from the main body of tests. And that gives you a hint as to what we're going to see when we do the actual factor analysis. So here's the factor structure. We actually found that we needed 5 factors to account for the data. The first was a capacity factor, which comprised multiple object tracking and visual working memory, along with spatial span and digit symbol coding. A factor that we called the search factor, or possibly the shifting factor, which included visual search, as well as the searchy neuropsych tests like the trail making test and letter cancellation. The digit span test had their own factor, arithmetic was its own factor, and the gradual CPT was the test that loaded onto the sustained attention factor. Some tests, such as flanker interference and the approximate number sense, didn't load onto any of these factors, although approximate number sense was weakly related to the capacity factor. So the answer is, to the question, do neuropsychology attention tests measure the same thing as vision science attention paradigms? The answer is, it's complicated. From a basic vision or cognitive science point of view, one thing to say is that there is no general attention factor, at least in our data. Instead, we identify 3 potential attention factors, including capacity, search or shifting, and sustained attention. If you're a neuropsychologist, the implications are that you should not use digit span and arithmetic for attention tests. They may be good for other purposes, but they're not measuring attention, at least not the way we think about it. However, the spatial span, trail making test, letter cancellation, and digit symbol coding are potentially good attention tests as long as you pay attention to what aspect of attention they measure. Number of caveats. There is some play, some art to deciding how many factors you need to explain the data set, although that's not going to explain all of the differences between our study, and Huang et al.'s study. Some things we're looking into right now are that response mode, touchscreen versus keyboard, makes a difference. We're also analyzing the effects of age and education. One thing that's very important is the sampling frame. We've heard a lot about weird samples, that is Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Huang et al.'s sample was Asian educated, industrialized, middle income, and authoritarian. The sample we're using here is a little different from both, I'm going to call it a pseudo-global internet sample, which is, I think, a little more diverse than either of those categories. Just to briefly look at the demographics, our sample was older and more female than Huang et al.'s, although still fairly young, more European and less Asian. We don't know where these people live exactly. And not all of them had a college education, though some of them were more educated and some less than Huang's sample. So, conclusions and implications. One thing is selective attention is not unitary. We kind of knew that, but we think this study points out the need for more investigations into how our different cognitive paradigms are related to one another or not. I think there's scope for expansion of our cognitive paradigms into the clinic, although, of course, that's a very complicated topic itself. And furthermore, I think there's room that this should inspire us to go into the neuropsych literature and start data mining to see what can we learn from how different clinical conditions affect things like spatial span or the trail making test, and that's going to give we now have some insight into how those things might affect the paradigms we're more familiar with in our theories.